Clara's hands shook as the billionaire shoved the ancient document at her face, his laughter echoing through the silent cafe. $10 million if you can read this? He mocked, certain she'd fail. But the waitress he'd chosen to humiliate had spent 6 years mastering dead languages. And she was about to expose the $70 million trap he'd walked right into? Clara Nguyen didn't remember the exact moment she became invisible. Maybe it happened gradually, year after year of keeping her head down, her voice soft, her presence as unobtrusive as the steam rising from coffee cups. She moved through the Grand Meridian Hotel's cafe like a shadow, refilling water glasses and clearing plates while conversations flowed around her as if she wasn't there at all. That's how she preferred it. Being noticed meant questions, and questions meant explaining why a 28-year-old woman with a degree in ancient linguistics was serving overpriced lattes to people who wouldn't look her in the eye. Her father's medical bills had answers for that. So did her younger brother's tuition. So did the cramped apartment in Queens where her mother worked 2 jobs and still couldn't make rent without Clara's help. These were the mathematics of survival, and they didn't leave room for pride or dreams or the dusty textbooks that still lined her bedroom shelf, filled with dead languages that nobody spoke anymore and nobody cared about. Tonight the cafe hummed with the usual symphony of wealth. Designers' handbags perched on chairbacks like exotic birds. Watches that cost more than Clara's annual salary caught the light from crystal chandeliers. She moved between tables with practiced efficiency, her uniform pressed and perfect, her dark hair pulled back so tightly it made her temples ache. She'd learned that tightness helped. It kept everything contained. The exhaustion, the disappointment, the small, stubborn part of her that still remembered what it felt like to be brilliant. Vincent Harlow arrived at 8:30, and the entire cafe seemed to tilt in his direction. Clara had seen powerful men before, but Harlow was different. He didn't just occupy space, he consumed it. Tall and broad-shouldered, with silver-streaked hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes, he swept through the entrance followed by an entourage of nervous-looking executives and translators. His voice carried across the room, loud and assured, the kind of voice that had never been told to quiet down or wait its turn. Clara's manager practically ran to greet him, bowing and scraping in a way that made her stomach turn. She busied herself at the coffee station, hoping she could avoid his table entirely. The universe, she'd learned, rarely granted such mercies. Nguyen, her manager hissed, appearing at her elbow. His cologne was too strong and his desperation stronger. Table 12. VIP service. Don't screw this up. Her hands were already shaking as she approached. Harlow sat at the center of a large corner table, surrounded by 6 or 7 men in expensive suits. Papers covered the surface, contracts and folders, and what looked like photographs of property developments. They spoke rapidly, switching between English and what sounded like Russian and French, their voices overlapping in the aggressive rhythm of people who believed their time was more valuable than oxygen. Clara set down water glasses with careful precision, trying not to let them clink. She was refilling the last one when Harlow's hand shot out and grabbed a document from across the table. The movement was so sudden that water sloshed over the rim of the glass in her hand. A few drops hit the paper. Everything stopped. Harlow looked at the water spots, then slowly raised his eyes to Clara's face. His expression was amused, predatory, like a cat that had just noticed a mouse doing something unexpectedly entertaining. The other men at the table shifted uncomfortably. Someone cleared their throat. "Well," Harlow said, his voice dripping with false warmth. "That's unfortunate." Clara's throat closed. She could feel heat flooding her face, that familiar terrible burn of humiliation that started behind her eyes and spread downward. "I'm so sorry, sir. Let me get you. Do you know what this is?" He held up the dampened document. The paper looked old, yellowed, covered in dense text that didn't look like any modern language. "This is a 12th century contract. Written in medieval Latin with old French legal terminology. One of only 3 surviving copies. And you just spilled water on it?" The words hit her like physical blows. Her vision tunneled. She opened her mouth but no sound came out. The other men at the table were watching now, their expressions ranging from uncomfortable to openly entertained. This was dinner theater for them. The clumsy waitress and the powerful man. A story they'd tell later. Loving? Harlow leaned back in his chair, studying her with that cold amusement. Can you read? The question was so deliberately insulting that for a moment Clara couldn't process it. Sir? Really? He glanced at his companions, inviting them to share the joke. Because I'm looking at someone who can't even pour water without causing an international incident. Makes me wonder what else you can't do. He held up the document again, waving it lazily. Tell you what. Let's make this interesting. This paper is part of a property deal I'm closing tomorrow. $50 million. But there's a section here that my translators are having trouble with, some archaic legal phrasing that doesn't quite make sense in modern terms. He stood up now, walking toward her with slow, deliberate steps. Clara wanted to back away, but her feet wouldn't move. She could smell his cologne, expensive and overwhelming. Could see the perfect white of his teeth as he smiled. I'll make you a deal, he said, loud enough that people at nearby tables were turning to look. You translate this passage for me. Right now. And if you can do it, if you can actually read this and tell me what it says, I'll give you $10 million. He paused, letting the number hang in the air. Tonight. I'll write you a check before I leave. The cafe had gone completely quiet. Clara could feel dozens of eyes on her, could feel the weight of their curiosity and judgment. Her hands were trembling so badly now that she had to clasp them together. This was a joke to him. A game. He was going to hand her that paper and watch her stumble over it, and then he was going to laugh, and everyone was going to laugh with him, and she was going to have to stand there and take it because she needed this job, needed every shift and every tip to keep her family's heads above water. Sir, I don't think, she started. 10 million, he repeated, louder now. That's what I said. Surely that's worth a try? He thrust the paper toward her. Unless you can't read after all. In which case, just say so. No shame in it. Not everyone can be educated. Something in those last words landed differently. Maybe it was the casual cruelty of them. Maybe it was the way his companions were grinning now, sensing blood in the water. Or maybe it was that Clara Nguyen had spent 6 years studying dead languages, had written a thesis on ecclesiastical Latin that her professors called brilliant, had once dreamed of teaching at a university before reality had taken those dreams and shredded them like tissue paper. She'd made herself small for so long, had folded herself into corners and shadows, had accepted invisibility as the price of survival. But she wasn't stupid. And she wasn't illiterate. And in this moment, with this man's mocking smile inches from her face, something old and fierce woke up in her chest. She took the paper. Her hands were still shaking, but she looked down at the text. The letters swam for a moment, blurred by nerves and the cafe's dim lighting. Then they came into focus. Medieval Latin, yes, but not pure Latin. It was mixed with Norman French legal terms, the kind of hybrid language used in property contracts during the Angevin period. She could see the structure of it, could feel the meaning clicking into place like tumblers in a lock. It had been so long since she'd done this, since she'd let herself be the person who could do this, but the knowledge was still there, buried but not gone. She looked up at Harlow. His expression was expectant, confident, already forming the shape of whatever joke he was going to make when she failed. Clara took a breath. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear, and every word was precisely correct. This section establishes a servitude agreement over the western boundary of the property. It grants perpetual access rights to the adjoining landowner for the purpose of water extraction from the underground spring located at the southeastern corner. She paused, seeing Harlow's expression shift from amusement to confusion. It also includes a clause stating that if commercial development occurs on this land, all profits from water rights must be divided equally with the holder of this servitude. That agreement is binding on all future owners. It cannot be dissolved or bought out. The silence that followed was different now. Comfortable. One of the other men at the table leaned forward. What did she just say? Harlow's face had gone very still. That's not, my translators didn't mention. Your translators probably missed it because the phrasing is deliberately archaic, Clara continued, and she could hear her own voice growing steadier, stronger. It's hidden in a subordinate clause that looks like standard property description. But it's there. And if you're developing this land commercially, which I assume you are based on these architectural plans, she gestured to the papers on the table, then whoever owns the adjoining property is entitled to half of your water rights revenue. In perpetuity. One of the executives grabbed the paper from her hands, scanning it frantically. Another was already on his phone, speaking rapidly in Russian. Harlow stood frozen, his carefully constructed superiority cracking like thin ice. Clara set the paper back on the table. Her hands had stopped shaking. The adjoining property is owned by the Rousseau family. They've held it since 1847. You can verify this with the land registry. I imagine they're aware of this clause, even if you weren't. In fact, I imagine they're counting on you not knowing about it until after you've invested in development. She looked directly at Harlow now, and for the first time in years, Clara Nguyen didn't feel invisible. You're being set up, mister? Harlow. This isn't a $50 million deal. It's a trap. The room didn't explode into chaos. That would have been easier, somehow. Instead, the silence stretched and deepened, became something thick and suffocating. Harlow stared at Clara like she'd just spoken in tongues, his mouth slightly open, that practiced confidence draining from his face in slow motion. Around the table his associates were moving now, grabbing papers, making urgent phone calls, their voices rising in panic and disbelief. Clara stood very still. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs, but outwardly she remained calm. Years of making herself small had taught her control, had taught her how to keep her body quiet even when everything inside was screaming. She could feel the weight of every eye in the cafe, could sense the shift in atmosphere as words spread through whispers and sidelong glances. The invisible waitress had just done something impossible. Harlow finally found his voice. How do you? He stopped, started again. Who are you? It was such a strange question. Clara had introduced herself 100 times to 100 wealthy patrons, had said her name while refilling coffee and clearing plates, and not one of them had ever actually heard it. She was part of the furniture, part of the service, as memorable as the wallpaper. But now Vincent Harlow was looking at her like she'd materialized out of thin air, like she was a person instead of a function. I'm Clara Nguyen, she said quietly. I work here. That's not what I mean. His voice was sharp now, almost angry. You just translated a 12th century legal document and identified a fraud scheme in about 30 seconds. Waitresses don't do that. The words stung more than they should have. Clara felt that old familiar shame trying to rise up, that voice that told her she was wrong for being more than what people expected, wrong for having knowledge that didn't match her uniform and her minimum wage and her careful invisibility. But she'd already stepped into the light. There was no going back to the shadows now. I have a degree in ancient linguistics, she said. I specialized in medieval Latin and ecclesiastical documents. I wrote my thesis on legal terminology in Angevin property law. One of the executives at the table looked up from his phone. She's right. I just had our Paris office pull the land registry. The Rousseau family does own the adjoining property and there is a recorded servitude dating to 1182. Jesus Christ, Vincent, how did your people miss this? Harlow's jaw tightened. He was still staring at Clara, but his expression had changed. The mockery was gone, replaced by something harder to read. Calculation, maybe? Or embarrassment that he'd been shown up by someone he'd intended to humiliate. If you're so educated, why are you serving coffee? It was a fair question in some ways, and in other ways it was the cruelest thing anyone had asked her in years. Clara could have explained about her father's stroke, about the medical debt that had swallowed her family whole, about choosing between her dreams and her mother's electricity bill. She could have laid out the economics of survival for him, could have shown him the mathematics that turned brilliant students into invisible workers. But she didn't owe Vincent Harlow her story. She didn't owe him anything except the translation he'd asked for. That's personal, she said simply. Something flickered in his eyes. Respect, maybe, or just surprise that she'd refused to answer. He pulled out his phone, made a call, spoke rapidly in clipped tones. When he hung up he looked back at Clara with an expression she couldn't quite parse. You just saved me from losing approximately $70 million over the next 5 years, he said. The water rights alone would have been worth twice what I paid for the land. The Rousseaus would have bled me dry through legal fees and shared profits. He paused. You understand what that means? Clara nodded slowly. She understood exactly what it meant. It meant Harlow could walk away from this deal, could find another property, could avoid a trap that would have damaged even his considerable fortune. It meant she'd given him information that was worth more than she'd earned in several lifetimes of serving coffee and clearing plates. I made you an offer, Harlow continued. His voice was different now, more measured. $10 million if you could translate that document. You did it. More than that, you analyzed it, explained its implications, and identified a sophisticated fraud. So the question is, are you going to hold me to my word? The cafe had gone quiet again. Clara could feel dozens of people holding their breath, waiting to see what she'd do. $10 million. The number was so large it didn't feel real, didn't connect to anything in her actual life. She thought about her mother's tired eyes, about her father in his wheelchair, about her brother who wanted to be an engineer but might have to drop out because they couldn't afford another semester. $10 million could fix all of that. Could fix everything. But something in Harlow's expression told her this was another test. He was waiting to see if she'd grab for the money, if she'd prove that everyone had a price and his price was just higher than most. He wanted her to take it so he could feel better about what had just happened, could frame this as a transaction instead of a humiliation. I don't want your money, Clara said. The words came out steady and clear, and as soon as she spoke them she knew they were true. Not because she didn't need the money, God, she needed it desperately, but because accepting it would turn what had just happened into something else. Would make it about him buying his way out of embarrassment instead of about her being capable and brilliant and right. Harlow's eyebrows rose. You don't want $10 million. No, sir. Why the hell not? Claire took a breath. This was the moment where she could make herself small again, could apologize and backtrack and accept whatever he offered. But she'd felt something shift inside her when she'd read that document, when she'd remembered what it was like to use her mind for something that mattered. She'd felt like herself again. Like the person she'd been before circumstances had forced her to fold into corners and fade into wallpaper. Because I didn't translate that document for money, she said. I did it because you asked me to, and because I could, and because it was the right thing to do. You were about to make a terrible mistake. I stopped you. That doesn't have a price attached. One of the other executives laughed, short and sharp. She just turned down $10 million on principle. Vincent, I think you've met your match? Harlow didn't laugh. He was studying Clara with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she held his gaze. She could see him thinking, calculating, trying to figure out what kind of person refused that much money and whether that made her admirable or insane. You know what I think? He said finally. I think you're wasting your life in this cafe. I think you've got a gift that's being poured into water glasses and wasted on people who don't even see you. He pulled out a business card, wrote something on the back and held it out to her. I own a consulting firm that specializes in international property acquisition. We deal with documents in dozens of languages, most of them archaic, most of them full of legal traps exactly like the one you just identified. I need someone who can read them, really read them. Not just translate words but understand context and history and intention. Clara looked at the card but didn't take it. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you a career. 6-figure salary to start. Full benefits? You'd be analyzing historical documents, authenticating contracts, advising on international deals. You'd be using that degree you worked for instead of hiding it under a uniform. He paused. Unless you're happy here. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Was she happy? Clara thought about her aching feet and her mother's worried calls and the way she'd trained herself not to think about the future because the future was just more of the same, forever. She thought about the textbooks on her shelf and the languages that lived in her head like sleeping birds, waiting for someone to let them sing. What about my family? She asked quietly. I can't just leave. They depend on my income. Harlow's expression softened slightly. Your signing bonus would be $50,000. Paid immediately. You could give them that and still have your salary going forward. He pushed the card closer. I'm not a nice man, Miss Nguyen. I'm not offering this because I'm generous or because I feel guilty. I'm offering it because you're brilliant and I need brilliant people, and because watching you serve coffee when you could be doing something extraordinary offends me on a professional level. Clara's hand moved without her quite deciding to move it. She took the card. The paper felt heavy, significant, like it was made of something more solid than cardstock. She could see her reflection in the cafe window behind Harlow, could see herself in her pressed uniform with her hair pulled back tight, and for a moment she saw two versions of herself overlapping. The one she was and the one she could still become. I need to give 2 weeks' notice, she said. Harlow smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. Fair enough. Start on the 1st of next month. My assistant will send you the paperwork. He stood up, and his associates began gathering their things, the energy at the table shifting from panic to relief. The crisis had been averted. The deal would be cancelled. Harlow would find another property, would make his millions elsewhere. As they prepared to leave, one of the executives stopped next to Clara. He was older than Harlow, with kind eyes and a French accent. That was remarkable, he said quietly. Truly, in all my years in this business, I've never seen anyone catch something like that so quickly. You have a rare gift. Clara felt tears prickling behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Thank you, she managed. When they were gone, when the cafe had returned to its normal rhythm of quiet conversations and clinking silverware, Clara stood there holding the business card. Her manager appeared at her elbow, his face red and confused. What just happened? He demanded. Did that man offer you a job? Yes, Clara said simply. But you're a waitress. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw the same blindness she'd seen in Harlow's face earlier. The assumption that what people did was all they were, that the uniform defined the person wearing it. She'd accepted that logic for so long, had let it convince her that she was less than she was. I'm a linguist, she corrected gently. I've just been waitressing to pay the bills. That night, after her shift ended, Clara took the long subway ride back to Queens with the business card tucked safely in her wallet. She thought about calling her mother but decided to wait, to make sure this was real before she let hope into her voice. The train was nearly empty, rattling through dark tunnels, and Clara caught her reflection in the window across from her. She looked tired like always. But there was something else there too. Something that hadn't been there this morning. She looked like someone who'd remembered how to be brave. When she finally got home, her mother was asleep on the couch with the TV playing quietly. Her father was in his room, and she could hear her brother studying at the kitchen table. Clara stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them, these people she loved more than anything, these people she'd made herself small to protect. Tomorrow she would tell them. Tomorrow she would explain about the document and the billionaire and the job that would change everything. But tonight she just walked to her room and pulled out one of her old textbooks, running her fingers over the Latin text like greeting an old friend. The words welcomed her back, familiar and beautiful and alive. She'd thought she'd lost this part of herself, had buried it so deep she'd believed it was gone forever. But it had just been waiting for the right moment. Waiting for her to remember that being brilliant wasn't something to apologize for. That taking up space wasn't a crime. That the person she'd worked so hard to become still existed, still mattered, was still worth fighting for. Clara Nguyen sat at her desk with an ancient text open before her, and for the first time in years, she let herself imagine a future that looked different from her past. A future where she didn't have to choose between survival and dreams. Where her gift wasn't wasted on people who couldn't see her. Where being invisible was a choice instead of a necessity. She thought about Vincent Harlow's mocking smile, about how sure he'd been that she would fail. About how that certainty had been just another kind of invisibility, another way of being unseen. But she'd proven him wrong. Had taken his cruelty and his arrogance and his $10 million joke and turned it into something else entirely. She'd reminded him, and more importantly, she'd reminded herself, that quiet people can be powerful. That invisible people can change everything. That sometimes the ones you overlook are the ones you should have been watching all along. And as she sat there in her small room in Queens, surrounded by languages that most people had forgotten, Clara smiled. Because tomorrow she would call the number on that card. Tomorrow she would accept the job and the signing bonus and the future that had just opened up in front of her like a door she'd thought was locked forever. Tomorrow she would stop being invisible. But tonight, right now, she was just a woman who'd remembered what it felt like to be seen. And that, she thought, was worth more than any amount of money Vincent Harlow could have offered. That was everything,